questions you all ask. I wanted to thank my committee members who worked tirelessly in pulling these off. This is the first of 6 guest faculty panels we're having in conjunction with 1133. You've probably already heard your professors this quarter use terms like qualitative and quantitative. I know in my class, students are having to do their first research paper by unpacking these terms and figuring out what they mean to different scholars. So that's the purpose of these lectures, inviting scholars from across campus to share with us what they do in their own research and writing. And we hope we tap people on the shoulder who actually do interpretive research, since that's tonight's topic, even as I recognize that that term is problematic, which I hope after these 3 people speak today, we'll have some questions interrogating that term a little more and what exactly interpretive research looks like. I prepared some notes, but I don't want to make this sound too formal. This isn't your typical academic conference. Oh, I should tell you I'm David Daniels. I'm one of the faculty in the university writing program. And last year, when I was given the task to teach my students qualitative research methods, I realized a few weeks beforehand that I'd never seen that term and I didn't know what they did in anthropology and so forth. So I asked a faculty member from anthropology, Christina Krebs, who will speak in a few weeks to us, to come to my class and explain to my students what exactly she did. And that hour spent with Christina was most useful for my students in understanding how qualitative differs from quantitative, from interpretive, and so forth. And out of that experience, this lecture series was born. So at the heart of interpretive research, or sometimes called textual research, is an interest in cultural artifacts and texts, by which I mean its actual images, the films and the photographs a culture produces, its novels, poems, short stories and plays, its news stories and editorials, but also, this may seem strange, its canned goods and its stuffed animals, its children's toys, and its video games, a culture's advertisements and billboards, its architecture, its fashion trends, its medical equipment, its personal hygiene products, its recipes and cookbooks, its paintings, its sculptures, its Oprah Winfrey's, and its Britney Spears. In other words, to the interpretive scholar, all of the world can be a text, or as Shakespeare famously wrote, all the world is a stage, open to interpretation and deep analysis and debate. And texts, if we look at them carefully, can reveal to us a particular culture's values and principles, its faith systems, or its lack of faith, its dominant debates and attitudes. Meaning is drawn not through empirical quantitative data systems and not through experiments conducted in the carefully enclosed laboratory setting, but meaning is drawn through the texts themselves. But apart from what interpretive researchers actually look at, and this is key, are also the kinds of questions that researchers ask. Who produced this particular text? When was it produced, and why? For what intended audience? For what apparent purpose? Whose values are being supported or thwarted by such artifacts? Let me give you a couple examples. How do we define the term marriage? Well, that depends on which texts we refer to in order to define that. And who are the authors of these texts? What were their original purposes? And for what cultural purposes do politicians or theologians or cultural critics reference these texts today? Does Eminem's hip-hop lyrics constitute a form of hate speech? Well, the interpretive researcher would respond possibly that depends, again, on the context, according to whose value systems, according to which audiences or listeners, and according to whose definitions of hate. Interpretive researchers believe, I think, and that's an important I think, that gets at the heart of the interpretive research, I think. We believe that knowledge is always only provisional, subjective, and in flux, meaning it can change over time. And that knowledge making is essentially always contingent upon various contexts, plural, contexts, plural. In other words, knowledge and the claims that we can make about things can never be proven as they might be within the biology lab. But one of the things we should consider is whether this is a limitation of interpretive method or if this is in fact one of its greater values. Today, especially y'all as young consumers, we're surrounded by images and texts with 24-hour news programming, not from one channel, but from multiple channels. We have embedded journalists in the war. We have personal blogs and YouTube and Facebook. We can go to tmz.com, which I go to every morning, and witness up-to-the-minute coverage of Amy Winehouse's cocaine binge or Owen Wilson's suicide attempt. And increasingly, such images are posted anonymously to the internet, as are chat room blips and what are called flame wars. And this can make interpreting such texts either more difficult for the researcher or even more exhilarating. Individually, what do these texts and images tell us about a particular celebrity or a particular TV show or movie or even a particular political candidate? And collectively, what does the swarm of these images reveal to us about ourselves and about our own values? Our panelists today include a wide spectrum of takes on the interpretive research. First speaking will be Ann Dobbins, chair of the English department, who is a specialist in rhetorical theory and history, and medieval literature, culture, and writing. She happens to be the woman responsible for hiring me here at DU a few years ago. She's the author of The Voices of Romance, Studies in Dialogue and Character, and co-author with Patsy Callaghan of Literary Conversation, Thinking, Talking, and Writing About Literature, and A Meeting of Minds, Strategies for Academic Inquiry and Writing. After Anne, we'll hear from Professor Ingrid Tay, chair of the History Department, who researches European history from the Middle Ages to the 19th century. She's a specialist in early modern British history with a particular interest in cultural and gender history. Ingrid's the author of Women of Equality, Accepting and Contesting Ideals of Femininity in England, 1690 to 1760. And she's writing a history of pets and pet keeping in the 18th century, which I think we'll hear about tonight. And finally, one of my colleagues, Jeff Ludwig from the University Writing Program, whose research and teaching areas include American modernism, cultural and postmodern theory, pedagogy, and rhetoric and composition. His archival research led to the Rhetorics of Subversion and Silence, the naming of Illinois State University's student union. His co-edited book, Transforming English Studies, New Voices in an Emerging Genre, is forthcoming from Parlor Press. So please welcome first Ann Dobbins.
I don't know if I can compete with pets. Most of my current research, even though I work on rhetoric and composition and written textbooks now, is in the area of medieval literature. And what I'm interested in is two competing genres. The romance, which is all about the ideal and knights, and probably you would know from seeing Monty Python's Holy Grail in its parodic form. And what's called the fablio. And the fablio is about a trick. It's about sort of a dirty joke. It usually has to do with some sort of a love triangle, and in some ways has something to do with sex and often something to do with scatological humor. Scatological humor, you may remember, it's like bathroom language. So I teach courses in Chaucer and in medieval literature, in addition to courses in teaching composition. Right now I'm teaching an undergraduate course on Chaucer. And so let me start with talking about the Fablio, because that's the more interesting part. One of the terms that Chaucer uses when he's dealing with Fablios, when he's dealing with this sort of lower world, this world of humor and joking, is a word called jape. And a jape is referring to a trick, a joke, a jest. It's sometimes used today, but it's really more archaic. Chaucer uses a lot. And frequently in the Canterbury Tales, he will say things like, beware of such a jape. Be careful about such a jape. Or, it was just a jape. So I was interested in why Chaucer is using the japes, and I'd say, going back to what David was talking about, that one of the problems with dealing with medieval literature is we don't know very much about Chaucer. And the people who wrote the romances, we know nothing about. We don't even know their names. So scholars are always doing this kind of guessing game. We're trying to amass enough information so we can make a good case, so that we can construct an argument that has what other scholars would consider to be credible evidence. And so we're looking at any kind of documentation that would allow us to do that. So we don't know much about Chaucer. We know that he worked for a number of aristocrats in his time. He had a number of civil service jobs. But that's really what we know about him. We don't know why he wrote, whether he was just entertaining the court. We have pictures of him reading to the court, but we don't know what he was up to. So he tells these stories, and the most famous one that sort of centers and is a nice example of the jape is the Miller's Tale. And you might have read the Miller's Tale in high school if you took a Chaucer class. It's the one with the fart in it. Okay, the woman sticks her rear end out the window and lets the guy, it's called the misdirected kiss. And then when the guy is angry and comes back and says he has a ring for her, and when she gives her another kiss, her lover, who happens to be in bed with her at the time, thinks that he will double the joke. And so he wants to participate in the jape. And so he sticks his rear end out. And at that point, the other prospective lover, who is quite angry that he participated in this directed kiss, has gone off to a blacksmith and taken a sharp coulter, which is the front of a plow, and has taken it directly from the fire and has come back. So when the other lover sticks his rear end out the window, he says, "I can't see you, it's dark. Speak to me, my lover." And Nicholas farts at me, at which point he takes the coulter and burns him in his toot, Chaucer says. And of course, everybody finds this very amusing. It's a very funny story. So I'm interested in what he's up to with that. So what do I do for research to find out what's going on at the time? Well, one of the things that you have to know is what kinds of things Chaucer would have read. And so by looking at all of the various texts that Chaucer wrote, and he wrote a lot, you can see places that he makes references to specific texts that he either had read in part or in their entirety, or knew enough about that he would have known something about them. Some of these are classical texts written by Cicero and Quintilian, classical rhetoric texts. Some of them are texts about the art of poetry that were written in the 12th and 13th century. And so you have to go out and read those and see whether or not they talk about jesting and how jesting would have been used. You also have to look at all of Chaucer's texts to see all of the places he uses the word jest. And so a lot of what you're doing is sort of digging through all of these old documents to see what they advise about the use of jest. And of course, you get a broad range of things. And jest can be used to lighten things, to kind of move away from serious matters and to add a little bit of leavening of humor, or the jest can be used to poke fun at somebody, but you have to be careful. And so if you're poking fun at somebody, it can't be cruel. And so if there are times in Chaucer's text that he's being cruel, then you see that perhaps there's some kind of judgment going on. I also rely a lot on the scholarship that's been done by other scholars. You don't want to have to go back, so that some of what I've talked about before is what we call primary research, looking at the original text to see what they say. The secondary research is the work that's already been done for you. Okay? You have to be careful with secondary research because you don't want to rely on that. But if other scholars who have other areas of expertise have already done a lot of the groundwork, you want to look at their work as well. So I do that kind of work as well. So it's kind of a balancing act. It's also going to the scholarship that's been done on the language and seeing what the scholars have put together. It's a Middle English dictionary. That's very extensive research that's gone into all of the very uses of all of the words that were used in the Middle Ages in English. So looking at all of the evidence that they've amassed for that. So that's another kind of sort of secondary research. Looking, as you might, at the OED, I would look at the MED. The MED is the Middle English Dictionary. So that's another thing. The other area that I work on then is the romance, the ideal. So in contrast to teaching just through humor or through showing various different ways that people are made to look like fools and what you can learn from that, I'm also interested in the way the other side operates. So if you're looking at an ideal character, how is the ideal character being portrayed? And again, this takes me back to classical texts, the way that characters are portrayed and what you're taught about how to portray a character. It's very formulaic, probably very boring to you. The joke's much more fun than the idealized. But again, looking at original text and secondary works. My other area of research is a 20th century rhetorician, and if you're in Jennifer's class, you read a little bit of him recently. That's Kenneth Burke, who was a 20th century rhetorician. And again, you can see this kind of ethical concern that I have. Kenneth Burke thought that the study of rhetoric and learning how to argue well and engage in discourse could help people solve problems without killing each other, without resorting to war, without resorting to violence. And so I'm very interested in Kenneth Burke's work, and he talks a great deal about that. But the area that I'm interested in primarily is in his public writing. In addition to all of the scholarship that he wrote, Kenneth Burke published a number of essays in journals like The Nation, The New Republic, journals that would be read by an educated audience, but not necessarily a scholarly audience. I mean, not primarily a scholarly audience. So I'm interested in looking at that. In order to read those texts well, and of course what I have to do is run off to the library and find all of the bound copies of all of those texts and go through and meticulously pull out every piece that Kenneth Burke ever wrote in the popular press. I also need to put them into the context in which they're written. So not only looking at what was going on historically and politically and so forth at the time. He writes against nuclear proliferation, for example, in the 50s and 60s. He writes very funny pieces attacking Henry Ford back in the 20s. I also need to set it into a context where I find a little bit more about what was going on with Kenneth Burke. Fortunately, we know a lot about Kenneth Burke. I even met him before he died. So I know a lot about him. And there are documents that I can look at to find out more about him that we don't have about Chaucer. We don't have letters that Chaucer wrote home when he went off to Italy. But I can get in touch with letters that Kenneth Burke has written. And a number of people have collections of letters that he's written, and so I can read through those. There are also letters which have not been collected and edited that I can go to archives and read. In addition, going to archives that have papers of his or people he was in contact with. I had one of those serendipity occasions where my daughter happened to be doing research on the editor who was for years the editor of Nation magazine, and she was at UCLA reading those documents and found an unpublished manuscript by Kenneth Burke and the letters accompanying it between Burke and the editor, Carrie McWilliams, of Nation magazine about the potential for publishing and what they thought of it, what people were saying. And so I have a document, I have a copy of a document of something that he wrote was never able to get into press. So it's going through sometimes old boxes and finding letters as well as looking at the secondary materials and the compilations of the letters. So that's what I do. It's interpretive, of course. The textbooks are a completely different animal. If you want to ask me about that, that's fine. But I won't bore you with that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Professor Kay from the History Department.
I have to admit, I was a little surprised when I got asked to do this a couple of weeks ago, I guess. My first reaction when, I think it was David, got in touch with me by email and said, would you be willing to give a talk? You know, we have these discussions about interpretive versus qualitative versus quantitative research, and would you talk about your research and interpretive research? And I emailed him back and I said, like what? Like I read stuff and write about it as opposed to doing experiments? And he said, yes. So in a nutshell, that's what I do. I read stuff and write about it as opposed to doing experiments. But part of my hesitation is, in fact, because historians are notoriously uninterested in exploring our own research methods or theorizing our own research methods. There's a very famous British historian whose response to a long and anguished question about whether or not we can know that the past really existed and whether we can get to it was just go out and do history. And historians tend to be almost proud of ourselves about the fact that we really don't spend a lot of time thinking about what we're doing, that we really just do it in a way that seems to us more or less intuitively to make sense. And I have to admit that that's the way in which I was trained myself. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about why I do what I do. I just do it. So my instinct on being asked to talk to you guys today was to give an example of what I do and to try and think through what it is that I do, why I do what I do, by talking about what I actually do. So, yes. As David mentioned, my current research project is a history of pets and pet keeping in 18th century Britain. And I thought what I would do today is talk a little bit about that project, why I'm doing that project, why this would ever seem like a good idea or something that one needs a book about. And then to talk a little bit about the particular kinds of research methods that I use in trying to write a book about the history of 18th century British pets and pet keeping. And one of the questions I think that I know when I was first starting out, both as an undergraduate and in grad school, that I had a really hard time thinking about was how do you ever find a topic? You know, when I was an undergraduate, everyone always gave me the question that I needed to think about, and my job was more or less to answer the question, either by going out and finding new materials or by being given materials with which to answer that question. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about why I actually came up with the idea of writing a book about the history of pets to begin with. And basically that evolved out of my previous scholarship. As David mentioned, I wrote a book on the history of aristocratic women in the 18th century, and I won't talk about why I did that. But this book actually emerged out of, the Pets book emerged out of the aristocratic women book. And it did so mainly by accident, and mainly by accident in a conversation that I had with my mother while I was in the middle of writing my dissertation. And for that and she wrote to her son twice a week, every week for years. And she didn't have a lot else to write about, and so she often wrote to him about her pets at length, talking about what they were doing, how she related to them, when they died, how sad she was, all of this kind of stuff. I would often, on the phone with my mother, tell her stories about these pets and this woman, because it was, again, more interesting than anything else that I did. At one point, she remarked, you know, you should forget about the women thing and write about pets. She was kidding, and I did actually finish up the book on the women thing, but when the time came for me to be thinking about another project, I actually remembered that conversation with my mother, and I started thinking about this, and I thought, well, you know, actually, I could do something on pets, and I could actually make a project that dealt with the history of pet keeping in the 18th century. The trick, of course, is that writing a book about pets, or describing what happens with pets, what kinds of pets people kept in the 18th century, that kind of stuff, might be interesting to me. It's probably not going to be interesting to a large number of other people. And so, in addition to finding a sort of topic to write about, one of the problems that we always have as scholars is to think about what's significant or interesting. Why is this topic important? And what's the question that I can ask about this topic that is actually worth asking? That would be interesting to someone beyond, say, me and the 3 other people who happen to be fascinated by the fact that squirrels made really good pets because they're good at learning tricks, right? So, as I started to think about this project, and I started to think about the ways in which this little old lady and other people in the 18th century wrote about the pets that they had, one of the things that I started to notice was that there was a real shift in attitudes toward pets over the course of the 18th century. That in the early 18th century, pet keeping was seen as, at best, a waste of time and money. Certainly morally suspect, and at worst, really actually a form of corruption. That it was actually sort of actively bad behavior to keep pets in the early 18th century. By the end of the 18th century, keeping pets was something that was applauded. It was something that was seen as a sign of moral virtue, as something that made you actually a good person. And so the driving question behind my research became, why is it that that change happens? And one of the fundamental questions that historians address is the question of change over time. Given that things are different now from what they were in the past, how do we get from the way things were in the past to the way they are now? However you define past and now. So for me, past is 1700, now is 1800. What is it that changes over time? How do we explain those changes in attitudes toward pets? And fundamentally, what does that tell us about 18th century British society? Right? Which is part of what gets us beyond a question that would be of interest to historians of pets, or historians of animals, or historians of the environment, into historians of 18th century society more broadly, for instance. What I'm trying to do with this project, in effect, is to talk about the social and cultural changes that happened over the course of the 18th century in Britain by using pets as my sort of way into 18th century culture. So let me look at the way in which people talk and write and think about pets and represent them visually, and the stuff that they create around pets, all of these kinds of sources, to try and think about what that tells us about other patterns of 18th century British culture. So, for example, one of the things I'm interested in is something called sensibility, which is sort of a movement or a state of mind that we can see emerging toward the end of the 18th century, which is the result of a number of different things that happened over the course of the 18th century, but which encourages people to be in touch with nature, that encourages a sense of close interaction with nature, that encourages people to express their feelings, to express their emotions, right? Again, if any of you are familiar, probably the most obvious thing would be if you ever read those Wordsworth poems, right? Right, but this idea of woohoo, I'm fantastic, I love nature, right? For me, one of the things that I think you can see in the development of the growing craze of pet keeping is that keeping pets becomes a way for people, even in an urban environment, right, even people living in cities, to say, I love nature, I'm close to nature, look, I love animals so much I keep one in my house, you know, look, aren't I a wonderful person? Right? Similarly, attitudes toward pets and pet keeping tell us things about attitudes toward women and toward fashion in the 18th century, because pets are very much associated with women and very much associated with fashion. And changing attitudes toward women over the course of the 18th century also interact with changing attitudes toward pets. So again, one example might be that keeping a pet lapdog in the early 18th century is seen as highly feminized, deeply suspicious, and lapdogs basically are seen as sexual substitutes for women who can't get laid. Right? By the end of the 18th century, you actually get poems praising lapdogs for their loyalty, loving virtues, their kindness to human beings, right? And it's still the same little tiny fuzzy rat dog that it was in the early 18th century. But people's attitudes toward the dog itself have changed partly as a result of changing attitudes toward women and changing attitudes toward the characteristics that are associated with women over the course of the 18th century. So those are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in asking as I'm looking at thinking about the history of pets and pet keeping in the 18th century. And finally, I guess the question I wanted to think about is, how did Andrew actually sort of get at this information, right? I've talked about these changing attitudes, I've talked about stuff that I've said happens over the course of the 18th century, right? One of the things that appealed to me about this topic was the way in which there's such a vast breadth of sources that I could use to explore it. So my first way in was through these letters, and one of my central kinds of sources is correspondence with people in the 18th century. Right? This gives me a window into people who choose to write about their pets or to write about other people's pets. So for example, Lady Wentworth, my little old lady that I started out this conversation with, you know, loves her pets, talks about them, you know, goes into mourning when her pet monkey dies. Her daughter-in-law writes about the same pets and goes, my God, they stink, they're incontinent, you know, when her monkey died, she went into mourning, I can't believe it, what a moron, I had to stop myself from laughing at her out loud, right? So you can learn something about the ways in which different people have different attitudes toward pets. And again, I can trace some of those changing attitudes over time through looking at how people write about pets in their correspondence. You can also see from that, of course, what kinds of pets people kept. So for example, at the beginning of the 18th century, very few people kept cats as pets. By the end of the 18th century, many more people kept cats as pets. You can also look at things like advertisements. Right? You get the development of the classified ad in the 18th century, and people advertise for lost pets. How much are you willing to pay for a lost dog? It says something about how much you value your animal. Right? The kinds of ways in which people describe their pets. Right? You can also see advertisements for pets themselves. You get the birth of the pet shop in the 18th century, right? Which has everything to do with global trade over the course of the 18th century. You can also see material culture, the creation of things like dog collars, actual little houses for your animals to keep inside your own house, right? The creation of special cushions or grooming items, cages for your birds, all of these kinds of things tell us things about the culture around pet keeping and the kinds of values that society has. So for me, all of these different ways of thinking about pet keeping also are tied to different kinds of evidence. And the different kinds of evidence enable us to ask different kinds of questions. So for instance, you aren't going to get much from pictures of dog collars, for instance, about people's emotional connections to their pets. Right? You get much more about that from correspondence. You can learn other kinds of things by looking at the material culture elements of things like dog collars, just as you learn different kinds of things by looking at people's portraits of themselves with their pets. or different kinds of things by looking at satirical prints or drawings, making fun of people and their pets. So for me, one of the things that's really interesting about the process of history is asking those kinds of questions. What is it that I can or cannot learn from these different kinds of sources? What is it that, what kinds of questions can I ask? And if I found a question that I think is interesting, how can I identify the sources that will enable me to answer that question? So the process of historical research is always this process of sort of conversation with your sources, as you have to switch the ways in which we're thinking about the material, right, and the kinds of questions we can ask, to adapt to the kinds of evidence that actually exists for us, right? I can't interview people from the 18th century because they're all dead, by definition. So I always have to be thinking about other ways into the material that I have and trying to build up a picture of that society using these different kinds of sources. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Very, very good. Before my colleague Jeff gets up here, I'm going to do a composition teacher thing. I'm going to give you 15, 20 seconds to jot down a note or follow-up question you might have. I heard paper rattling, so if you wanted to take some time to process, you can do that. I also just wanted to thank Professor Kay and Professor Dobbins, because it occurs to me how hearing them talk, they're illustrating very specifically things I'm trying to discuss in my classrooms at an abstract level. And it's making me wish all of my students were here, whether it's the issue of context or in my class what we call posing a Stacy's question, which is essentially what Professor Tate was just discussing, having something, the so what question, having something worth talking about. And how to approach these texts through personal correspondence and archives. I'm loving it, but I'm also an academic, so I might be loving it more than some of you. I understand that. Okay, Professor Ludwig has to be here. The other two came here out of a love for learning. So here's Jeff.
Jen and Blake are passing around. There's only 20 copies, so you might have to share with some people, and that's fine with me. I want to also thank Professor Dobbins and Professor Tang for coming. Let's give them another round of applause. In terms of myself, I want to talk about how I approach the interpretive research tradition in my 1133 class, which I believe I see a bunch of friendly faces in here and some not so friendly. And how just like actually what David was talking about, how I kind of approach the interpretive research tradition in a kind of abstract way, but it's illustrated nicely by what both Professor Dobbins and Professor Tang have been talking about so far. And then I kind of want to offer a very brief description of what I do and ask students to do in terms of, or within the framework of that interpretive paradigm, in terms of a small scale kind of model, which actually is interesting to kind of compare and contrast with what Professor Tang is doing with her pets. And then last, I'm going to offer a couple of examples. So what I'm going to start with is going to sound like a lot of what David talked about before we started everything. Very, very, very broadly speaking, interpretive or textual research both explores and explains human experience. It doesn't report facts like a quantitative and to a certain extent a qualitative research tradition does. And it moves into a kind of formulation of an argument through a writer's own interpretation of that experience. And since my 1133 and all the 1133s are about argumentation, with the interpretive tradition being one method of gathering research and data, as well as providing a method of providing that argument, we really start with that kind of argument. The interpretation commonly begins with a primary text, where the writer gives a meaning to that text and explains his or her view of that text's importance to the reader. Since interpretive research is open and speculative, there's never really absolute proof. The research and argumentation is open-ended, and indeed it actually encourages alternative views and arguments. So while the text or argument is always open, the writer is asked to make a claim and then argue for that claim, usually starting with some sort of text in itself. The research is meant to offer some sort of new insight to a past or a text analyzed, and the author's primary goal is to make that past or text important and provide new knowledge to what's being analyzed with whatever text they're working with. usually it commonly begins with a text. Professor Dobbins provided some excellent examples. Professor Dobbins starts by looking at Chaucer and what a jape is, and looking at documents that Chaucer may have read to provide a context for that. Professor Tate looks particularly, in fact, she mentioned just a plethora of primary sources, in particular from poems to letters to pictures to advertisements to whatever. So it usually starts with some sort of primary text, and that text is usually themselves is an indicator or an artifact of that human experience in a given context, moment, or cultural situation. My students will hear this on Tuesday. Anything is a text, I say. David gave us a couple good examples to start off. And from a novel to a poem to a movie to an advertisement to a photograph to a pair of boots, anything is a text. Because anything can be a text, we actually spent some time in my class discussing how to identify a text in relationship to the contingent forces or cultural context that surrounds it. Therefore, interpretive research commonly analyzes both primary and secondary text critically. Beginning with that notion of textuality, which is commonly associated particularly with primary sources, interpretive research starts with those primary sources and enacts an interpretation of those through a critical reading of what that source or what that pair of boots or what that letter tells us about its meaning. Secondary research then is used to support the writer's claims of that text meaning. And this is commonly done by either, one, providing the reader with facts and or context about those texts, historical information that is important, or number two, other interpretations of that text or interpretations that are related to the one that the person is working with, so that we can work to situate an argument. That's a term I use in my 1133 a lot. So we can, as the person staking that argument or making that argument, we can work to figure out where we stand in our interpretation, in our claim, in relationship to what other people claim about that text, whether it be a poem or a movie or whatever. That particular component, that situating arguments through research, is really what 1133 is about, at least for my class. But the course is also dedicated to a process of inquiry, or in the case of interpretive research, inquiring into the meaning of things, of texts, of the past, etc., by offering argumentative interpretations of those artifacts. So interpretive research is also therefore placed as only one method of academic inquiry, or one method of academic argumentation among many. And part of what we try to do overall in 1133 is to show that interpretive research is appropriate for a particular discipline, a particular rhetorical situation, or a particular audience, and that other rhetorical situations and other audiences require a different kind of research, a different kind of inquiry. Since the focus of 1133 is on argumentation and the rhetorical moves authors make through research, to make those arguments valid or persuasive for an academic audience, with interpretive research, we focus on the moment when that interpretation is argument in itself. We focus on the fact that seeing a text in a specific way is going to differ from what somebody else is going to argue. It's going to differ from what many people argue, and that the way you see it is actually an act of argumentation. So one of the things that it requires you to do when you're writing up or when you're creating that argument is to first of all start off with some kind of statement of what that argument or interpretation is, and then provide where you fit within a larger cultural context and how that context is important to arguments made about that text in particular. Number three, where the author fits in with other interpretations, where other people have made arguments about that. And then, and this is kind of unique to interpretive research in particular, I think Professor Tang called this a read things and write about them. Number four is you provide a kind of reading or a kind of critical analysis of that artifact, whether it's a poem or a movie or a photograph, and I've passed around one that I'll talk about in a little bit. And then lastly, of course, you provide support for the arguments that you make, whether that's through that description or critical analysis of the primary text itself, or through figuring out where you stand in relationship to people who have already written about it. So the assignment I do in 1133 essentially is I ask students to pick an artifact. There's a room, it was in the basement, which I thought was more appropriate, but now it's on the third floor of Penrose Library. It's the DU archive room. And in the DU archive room is anything having to do with DU. From DU's history all the way up until yesterday, There are documents, there are stuffed animals, there are photographs, there are cookbooks, there are tons and tons of stuff that have to do with the University of Denver, all things that are situated in particular historical context. So what I do is I ask my students to use a combination of primary, which I ask them to go into the archive room and pick something, anything, a photograph. There's an old mascot head, it's about that big, it's in there. And it's Denver Blue, by the way. But there's an old mascot head that's in the archive room. Just to pick anything from the archive room and interpret what it means and why that interpretation is important to DU history. And then what also, in addition, and a lot of other questions, why or how that particular moment in history or how that particular artifact has affected what it means to be a DU student or a DU faculty or a DU staff member today. So you start with the primary research, pick something from the DU archive room, and then you do some secondary research on that as well. So the first, the students usually go in the archive room first. Steve Fisher is the guy in that room, and he's a great guy. His staff is really nice too. They help students sift through stuff that they might be interested in. From there, whatever the artifact they choose is, whether it's textual or otherwise, because there's one of the more interesting ones that, other than what I just passed out, one of the more interesting ones that I have found as an archivist is a flyer that was posted about a student protest during the late 60s. It was just something that was literally posted up on campus. And I found that to be a really interesting article. So once the students sift through that, they take that as their starting point for their research. They're asked to find out as much as they can about the primary source by researching where it fits within the larger history of DU as an educational setting, perhaps within the larger history of Colorado at that particular time, or perhaps even within the larger history of the United States at that time. So the first thing that I have the students do is create a detailed description of what that artifact is. In essence, that description becomes the basis of their interpretation or the claim that they're going to make. Their description is revised to become not only a part of the paper, but also a part of how they read or interpret that text or create their argument. So they're asked to describe not only what the artifact is, what it looks like, what it feels like, how it smells, etc., but where it fits into history, when was it created, why was it created, who was it created by, who put it in the archive room, why did they do that, but also what is the history of the people or persons who produced it, why is that significant, how has DU changed over time because of that artifact's influence? What do we pride ourselves now on because of a certain thing? And I'll give you an example of that in a little bit. As the basis of that interpretation, their goal is to write their own history of DU at that moment using both primary and secondary sources. It's not only you find out about DU in particular, but you also find out about Colorado or the United States. You also find out what other people say about a particular artifact or if they interpret it in a certain way. The artifact is their primary text. It is the thing to which they'll offer their interpretation of its importance to the university and its students, the faculty, the larger community, etc. The argument that the students create then is over its importance. So their argument relies on not only providing a new critical view of the artifact, but also in supporting their ideas in ways, in terms of why this moment is important, and use secondary data, especially historical context, to create their arguments. So aside from having them write the paper and draft the paper and work on sharing their descriptions, their artifacts with students, and just talking about how cool things are, and being just basically dorking out for an afternoon. I also have students to spend some time reading a book called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men by two famous, they wouldn't have loved this term, but they were ethnographers. What's in this book is it's actually both documentation of Southern farmers during the Great Depression, both through photographs and the written text itself, but it also allows us as readers or interpreters today to gain meaning not only from the written text, but the photographic texts as well. In class, we use this as a method for arguing about how to interpret. So we start with a description, then we move into how to interpret using A. Walker. What details give us meaning into the text, and what and how does historical context play a role, and how can critical interpretation happen by a researcher by providing that description in order to argue over what meaning of that is based off that description. So some student examples. And overall, in terms of the assignment, I encourage a range of topics. It depends on whatever you can find in the archive room. But some things that I ask students to do. Consider a history of DU sport or sports. So I've got a lot of papers on the DU mascot and how that changed and evolved over time, and how the current mascot, whatever their interpretation is, does or does not reflect the values of DU and its school spirit. I've got stuff about the football team that DU used to have up until, I don't know when that was, I think it was the late 70s. And then I've also gotten stuff about Title IX and how Title IX affected DU. I've had a lot of students look into the history of the DU building. So the building is kind of their artifact, but sometimes the artifact comes from a news source instead, and then they talk about how their interpretation of that news source relates to the history of the building. The buildings are pretty much some of the oldest stuff on campus, so sometimes it's interesting to take a look at that. So I've had papers on Mary Read, on the Evans Chapel, and the history of that, and the fact that it used to be downtown, and I got one here, history on the Ritchie Center. One interesting paper I got discussed how Penrose, the library that sticks out like a sore thumb on campus, was built on the top of what used to be called Denver West, which was a student protest ground where students literally set up tents and protested the Vietnam War, et cetera, and things like that. That was an interesting paper to read. I've also had students consider writing a history of the DU organization or department or program, which is interesting because there's a lot of documents in the archive room about the development of a particular program or their major. They can look into the history of their major here at DU. So for example, let me give you the visual first. One example, and this is what I kind of passed around, so if you want to share with people. This student took this small newspaper clipping that she found in the archive. It's actually from the DU newspaper from actually, it was in the DU newspaper, but it was actually published in the DU yearbook. There's a yearbook that's published every year by the University of Denver. This comes from the year 1943. It's a small description and picture of the Air Corps detachment at the University of Denver. From this artifact, the student interpreted that as showing unity among the students and the faculty and the staff across campus concerning the World War II effort. And what she does then is to make the argument that her interpretation, the way that the photograph and the way the clipping is set up, she interprets that as showing that unity, and then makes the argument that today you wouldn't find that on TV, especially in the context of the war in Iraq. We don't see barracks on campus anymore. We don't see the Air Corps detachment at the University of Denver, and we don't actually advertise things like that. So she made the argument that the University of Denver isn't as unified as it was in that particular historical context. Another example, one student talked about the founding of DU's Graduate School for International Studies and its founder, Joseph Corbel. In it, the student argued that the change of the program, which used to be called the Social Science Foundation, to the GSIS in 1948 signaled not only a change in the program's mission, but put DU on the map in many ways, especially because the GSIS ended up being responsible for the Charrington Global Scholars Program, which brings so many students into the University of Denver. A third paper talked about used the context of the U.S. Cold War and what was called the Broadmoor Tournament, which was a hockey tournament that was done in 1978, and how that larger world context played out in small ways through the games played between Soviet hockey teams that came over to Colorado and visited, and Colorado hockey teams in particular. He makes the argument in there that that the pride that DU has in its hockey program stems from this Broadmoor tournament. That the tradition of hockey that brings a lot of students to DU as well stems from the pride that the students felt during this time and during this era, especially considering the larger context of the Cold War that played out in the United States at this point in time. He writes, partaking in a U.S.-Soviet cultural exchange such as this one was perhaps the beginning to the commitment to abroad programs and scholarships that Denver provides today. If you have any questions about the example papers or anything about how I approach the assignment in my class, I'll be happy to answer those. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. I did want to leave some time for questions for our three panelists tonight. I'll give you a moment to, take my picture. Give you time to formulate those. I know I have a question, but I want to make sure it's not just the faculty from the writing program who ask questions. Anything? Should we make them stand up here, or is that awkward? I should ask you. What's your question first?
I just want to know if they found that there was a more concentration of use of primary or secondary research, or if it's only equal out.
Like when we do our research,
Yeah, or
concentrate more on primary or secondary research.
I think it depends on how you start the inquiry process, the way that Ingrid was talking. I mean, it seems like, the way Ingrid answered it, it seems like hers grew out of the primary. My looking at JP grew out the primary texts. At that point then, I looked to see what other people had done. Had this project already been done? So that meant looking at secondary research, the way people are talking about comedy in Chaucer and joking in Chaucer. Then I went back and started digging. So it depends. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's always, I guess, a dialogue between the primary and the secondary stuff, because you need to know what's been said in the secondary material so that you know whether or not you're saying anything new and interesting, right? If you're just reproducing what somebody else has said, then you aren't doing something that has a point to it. But the fact is, I think, at least in my field, there's a huge emphasis. It's the primary source of research that you're doing that is the significance that is what matters in what you're doing. The secondary stuff matters really only in the sense of establishing for your readers, this is what other people have said, so this is how I am contributing to that conversation. And frankly, if it were the other way around, I would not be a professional historian, because I find most history written by, well, not just other professional historians, but also me, kind of boring most of the time. What's really fascinating is the primary source stuff. It's getting that opportunity to read and think about what the dead people produce, to sort of get that window into their lives. But again, that's really where our emphasis is. It's using that material to build up your argument.
For me, one of the reasons I started doing my dissertation is because I thought that everybody else had written about Hemingway was full of it. So I went back not only to the novel, but at the same time, something like Sun Also Rises, which is what I ended up writing about. It's such a canonical work that I had to actually start with the secondary sources to figure out what everybody was talking about first, and then figure out where I was going to enter into that. I ended up actually going to the Kennedy Library and looking at his original manuscript, which was a lot of fun. But, and then saying, you know, you guys are completely wrong, or you guys are on the ball, or you guys have it wrong, and here's why. I've seen the manuscript, here's my interpretation of it. Now, does that mean mine's right? No. I mean, somebody will argue against me too. But sometimes you start with the primary research, and that's just the thing that's so extremely interesting you want to write about it and research it. Other times you start with reading just the secondary research, going, okay, you guys are full of it, and I want to try and do something.
And I'll underscore something Ingrid said about situating yourself in relationship to what other scholars have written. In my class, at least, sorry to break this news to you, when you do the quantitative and qualitative units, you'll do this as well. You will read background research, situate yourself in the form of what we call a literature review that starts off some of these social science papers and so forth. But that's always so key. Not just to make sure, am I saying something new and interesting? Am I not duplicating somebody else's work? But how does the secondary research challenge or help me deepen and modify my own thesis statement?
It also helps you define an audience, because you're thinking about, what are people interested in? What are the questions that people are addressing?
Yeah.
What are the controversies? How am I going to enter into that controversy? So in some ways, it's thinking about who's going to be reading this, what do they already know, or what do they think, and how am I going to address it?
Other question? Way up there? Yes.
Yes. What
That's a good question, because that happens a lot. Sometimes it's just digging some more. Sometimes it's looking at the evidence. I think one of the problems is that what I see in my own students is they've come up with a kind of answer, and then they go out and try to find the evidence to support that answer, and then they find all this evidence that doesn't necessarily fit with what they're looking at, and they say, oh, I'm not finding this, instead of saying, maybe the evidence is going to lead me someplace else. And so it's being really nimble, it's being flexible, it's being willing to say, maybe my question is not the question I'm going to address, maybe I need to go someplace else. And it's letting yourself go with the stuff you find, and that's part of the fun, that's the search, that's following it to the end of your quest, if I could use my romance terminology.
Or maybe there's not enough evidence right now. And maybe you need to, instead of trying to find it and hammer it down and put a nail in the coffin, so to speak, maybe there's just not enough evidence. You can say, this is what I can present you at this point. In future research, I can do that, it's fine. But here's what I can give you right now.
I think it's also about maybe sometimes also thinking about the evidence differently. In the field that I started out working in, women's history, for a very long time, the argument was, you can't do women's history because there's no evidence, right? Women were illiterate up until around 1800, so, Lord knows you could possibly do medieval women's history because there are no sources, right? Women were illiterate, they didn't write anything down, you can't do that, right? But what people started to do then was to say, well, okay, first of all, maybe there are more sources than we think there are, so you start looking for and finding more sources written by women or that might have been written by women. But the other thing you do is you start to think, well, if we can't get at women through the traditional written sources, what sources might we be able to think about women through in other ways? So maybe we look at criminal convictions, right? Maybe we look at law cases to see what laws about women are, or to see women engaged in criminal cases. Right? Maybe we look at portraits of women. Maybe we look at business operations, right? And we can get ways into thinking about women's history even though there aren't those traditional written sources. So sometimes it's a question about saying, well, if the evidence that I thought I was going to use won't let me answer that question, maybe I need to find different kinds of evidence to get at the question I want to answer.
Other questions? Yes?
I've got one. Okay, so I know you start with your primary and your secondary research, but do you really start with more like a broad question and not start so narrow-minded? Because I feel like when you just go into start with your research, I think we so overwhelmed.
Let me address that real fast, because I was talking, we went to a conference in New Orleans this past weekend, most of us, and I went to a talk by a Harvard historian who also teaches composition up there. And he addressed this question, I think, in an interesting way. He always teaches his students, have a thesis statement, develop an argument, and use the evidence to support it in your paper. And then it occurred to him, wow, as an historian, I do the exact opposite. That is, I have a topic, and I sit with the evidence, and I read more and more and more, and maybe at the end of months, I might have a general claim, like the way John Adams thought about his wife tells us something about John Adams. And that's like the most he can do to venture toward a thesis. So he was saying, as a historian, my research process is very much what you just described as the broad topic, rather than the narrow argument or thesis, which is a little problematic because y'all have to write 3 or 4 papers in 10 weeks, and we're sensitive to that. You can't just look at paintings of dogs and squirrels from the 18th century for months and months and come up with a claim at the end. My answer is I don't know how to do that in 10 weeks, whether or not to start off with a pointed question or a broader topic or interest. Can you all address that?
It sucks for you. I have all the time in the world. I mean, I do think that one of the process really is that you have to be thinking always about getting to a question. Even if you don't have the question or have the argument that you want to be making at the beginning, the problem that I find sometimes is with my students is that there's a sort of, I want to write about X. And you think, well, why? Why do you want to write about that? What is interesting about that? And one of the ways in is sort of, what's interesting about that? colleagues talks about, the thing that kind of bugs you, you know, the thing that doesn't seem to fit, or the sort of niggling question, or the detail that you get hung up on, sometimes that's a way in to thinking about the question that will be interesting and compelling for you. And one of the things is to give yourself enough flexibility, I guess, to let yourself think about what is interesting to me instead of what do I think is, you know, doable, or the thing that my professor is looking for, the thing that somebody else is looking for. Obviously, you have to take all that stuff into consideration too, you know, to be realistic. But you can at least sort of start with that sort of, am I noticing something? Am I noticing patterns in what it is that I'm looking at? And that can be a way of thinking about what can I then do with that material. But you're always having that conversation between the question of the topic that interests me, the question that seems to be developing, and then can I really follow that question, or do I need to change the question as you go back into the research?
I always start with the question. If I start with the topic, I don't know what to do. You know, I can say, jesting, japing. Well, you know, what about it? Why am I interested in it? What do I see it a lot? Do I see it in certain kind of instances? It's always, what's Chaucer up to? You know, this interesting, intriguing mind is, he's doing something. What's he doing with this? What am I supposed to do with it? It's always a question. I never start with the topic, and I never start with the basis.
You never start with an answer to the question.
Exactly. I don't start with an answer to the question, because then what's the point of the inquiry? I already have the answer. An inquiry is trying to answer a question.
And sometimes the question is, why do I think that this is cool? And then it becomes something else. How does X relate to Y?
We have time for one more question, I think. Anybody? Very good. Look, if you found this helpful, tell your classmates to get here April 16th. Luc Baudouin is going to talk to us about Russian literature and culture, and Annette Stott is going to talk to us about graveyards throughout the Rocky Mountain region and interpretive tombstones, which should be pretty cool as well. All right, thank you guys for coming.